Tanny, I don't know how you do it. Oh, ouch. Remembering to fix the oven. Uh-oh. Good luck with your turkey. Um, while we're waiting for people to come in, I just want to say that one of you was reading a book about Shakespeare and beekeeping and how important beekeeping was to older societies. And I have to say, one of the traditions I have always loved is that if the owner of a bee of a beehive, if a beekeeper dies, that's what I'm looking for. I just did an interview, so I'm tired. If a beekeeper dies, somebody's got to tell the bees. You have to tell the bees, or they will, I guess, lose interest in the world and either die themselves or turn against the new owners. So telling the bees that their master has died or their keeper has died is an important old tradition, which I just really love, actually, talking about things being intertwined. All right, so California, lots of California, 3 Californias in a row. I was just out there. Now I'm back in Maine, and it's a lot colder here. Hey, Elaine from Union, right up the street. Street being a relative term. All right, so I want to start today with an overview that I think is important in this moment. So one of the things that is really clear to me is that every time I try and write about anything happening in the Middle East, I am swamped with complaints from people who are upset about the deaths in the Palestinian territories, or people who are upset that they feel that I have been anti-Semitic in the way I have presented whatever the news is in that moment. And I wanted to explain to you what I think about when I think about conflict, or when I think about politics, or when I think about societies, or when I think about history. So just to clarify, when I talk about the Middle East, I do not talk about those societies because I am not trained to. You can't just, people make this mistake all the time. You can't just start doing the history of another country by learning the facts, because facts without the society behind them are somewhat meaningless, to be honest. So what I write about is the United States and how it interacts with other countries and the ways that those two things come together. So people who are mad because I'm not talking about the establishment of Israel, for example, or the long history of conflict in the Arab world is I just can't do that. I just can't do that. So that being said, what I have tried to do was to talk about events since October 7th. Now, I have written actually about Israel before that, Israeli elections, for example, but that I have occasionally written about what's happened since October 7th. Probably not as much as I would like to, but because the influx of hate mail is just so extraordinary that I have to be in the right mood to take it on, because it really sucks, basically. But that being said, I think there's a really important story that nobody is touching about what's going on with the United States' reaction to what's happening in the Middle East. And it is this. So, and mind you, there are all kinds of global stories going on here that I've talked about before here. I think last week that I've written about, the Arab world is reacting in a certain way because, remember, all the Arab leaders have to stay in power, even if they have autocracies. They don't want too much unrest in their streets. And, there's an issue in Israel that Netanyahu's government is a far right government that has been intruding on Palestinian rights and on Palestinian land since it's been in power and before. There's issues with the fact that Hamas doesn't really represent Palestinians. I mean, there's all sorts of internal politics going on in that region. But what I want to talk about today is the way I think about societies, because I think it matters. And that is this. I think that most people, and I guess I need to limit this to the United States as well, because that's what I study, but I think it's probably universal. Most people are ordinary, decent people who just want to live their lives and put food on the table and get along with their friends and, try and get their kids to adulthood without anything totally untoward happening. And basically just are decent human beings are trying to get along. But there are some people, a very few people, who like power and they want power. So they need to get people to back them. And there are a number of ways that you can do that. But what you're trying to do is get popular. And one of the key ways that you can do that in the United States, again, but I think this is probably more general, is to appeal to people's fears. And those fears are, I believe, culturally specific. So in the United States, for example, you can appeal to people based on race. And that doesn't necessarily mean just black, white. Any kind of racial or ethnic tensions can be exploited, which is how you end up in urban areas with one minority turning against another minority. You can appeal to people based on race or gender. That is, you don't want women to get out of place, or on class. Those people are going to rise up and take us over, or have taken us over. Or religion is another big one. There are all kinds of stressors in a society that somebody who wants power can exploit to get power. And that is what I tend to look for, is what are the stressors that people are using? And at the end of the day, and this is crucial, who's going to benefit the most from whatever is going on? And who, that maybe a number of people benefit. So, that's something I'm always trying to tease out. Who is this good for? Who is this move good for? Like this looks like a fight between this person and this person, but are they being set up by someone else? So that way of looking at the world, then, I think, comes down to the way that societies talk about themselves and the ways that those people who are trying to garner power use that society. And they do that by telling stories. They're telling stories about how their particular society works. That is, you need to stand behind me or those people are going to come take all your cookies. Those stories really matter. And so one of the things that is interesting to me about what's happening in the Middle East is that for the United States, those stories are taking on a really different character than the normal stories that we have been hearing for a long time. That is, they are virulently anti-Semitic, some of them. Some of them are talking about Americans committing genocide, especially Joe Biden committing genocide, which, I mean, just in actuality, it's another country that Biden is obviously putting pressure on, but Israel under Netanyahu is making his own decisions. There's all kinds of stressors in these new narratives that tie into old American history, but that suggests to me that this is a time when it is worth looking at who benefits from this fight. Now, and I'm not going to go into that now because as you sit there and think about it, you're going to come up with a number of different people or organizations that could be benefiting from the kind of ways that we are talking about the Middle East. The same, though, that same pattern of power and people trying to get power by being popular, I think has a lot more to say about the United States in this particular moment. That is, if you're somebody who wants power and you want people to follow you, you need to tell stories that people are going to respond to. So the easiest thing to do is to go for fear. And you can see this obviously in America's radical right, which has really doubled down on the idea of convincing their followers that their livelihoods and even lives are under attack by people like me, which does not actually reflect reality. I'm one of those people in the middle who doesn't want power over anybody. But trying to get followers by stirring them up with fear is a story that's working, or that has worked in the past. But the reason I wanted to emphasize that today is that if you want to change a society and you want to change the direction that leaders go, those people who do want power, what we need to do is tell different stories. We have to tell them that they will get our support, not if they double down on fear or racism or anti-Semitism or attacks on children or any of the things that are currently making up our narratives, but by saying we will support people who promote education, who call for civil rights in the United States, who protect voting, for example. Those are the things that we want to see in a leader. And the reason that I picked those things is because that is precisely what Lyndon Baines Johnson, President Lyndon Baines Johnson, did once he got into office after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, which happened 60 years ago tomorrow. A man who desperately wanted power, who loved having power. If you look at any image of LBJ, you will see him leaning over people. But the stories that prompted him to give us the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and to promote education and to promote the arts and to promote the idea of a society that protected civil rights and tried to reach a new height of human achievement. Those are stories that he reacted to in order to change American society. So it's worth thinking about the stories that we tell. And one of the reasons that I always try so hard to tell stories about equality and about agency and about education and about equal rights and about things that I care about is because the more of us who echo that, the more likely it is that people who are out there right now that we might not have heard of, who have power, will say, oh, I'd like their votes. So instead of me trying to destroy public education, maybe I should try and support it. Or rather, we'll get those people who support it trying to run for office rather than people who are trying to tear it down. So I wanted to talk a little bit today about the bigger picture, not just who's fighting whom and what tools they're using to fight whom, but the idea of power, and that at the end of the day, governments are about who we put in power. And the things that drive those people are about the stories we tell about people we are going to support. So this next year is a really good time to enforce the idea of stories about our country and about our people, and perhaps international stories that reinforce the idea that our leaders should follow us rather than continuing to double down on the idea of fear. All right, so more specific questions here. Lots of them coming up here. Easy ones first. Somebody asked, will anybody challenge Joe Biden for the Democratic presidential nomination? And the answer to that is no. And this is really interesting in a number of ways. So first of all, for a sitting president to be challenged from within the party is almost certainly a path to destruction for everybody in the party, because it suggests such internal division that they can't even agree on a candidate. And a great example of that is Ronald Reagan challenging Gerald Ford in 1976, and obviously both of them going down to disaster. Nobody's going to do that with Biden. I would also point out, though, that aside from that general principle, Biden's a hell of a strong character. I mean, his only downside is his age, and yet the fact that he knows all these people and has been able to nail together the coalitions he's nailed together on the international level, has nailed together the bipartisan stuff he's gotten through the Congress, the fact that he has managed to do as much as he has done, really to rival LBJ or even FDR. I mean, I don't understand why anybody would challenge him. We have this candidate who appears to be challenging him, and I can't quite figure out what's up with that, because he's somebody who's never been heard of before, and he looks rather as if he's just intended to be a spoiler. It's a little hard to imagine that anybody in the party would take him on simply because his policies are working. And so for the younger people who want to have a future, they don't want to be seen as somebody who has stood against Biden when his stuff is actually working. I mean, that would be suicidal for their own political interests. So that being said, a couple of things. First of all, the issue with Biden's age is being backstopped right now by Kamala Harris, who's quite young. and or not quite young. I think she's 50. I don't know. Somebody put it in the chat. It's 58 or something. Maybe I'm wrong. I think she's in her 50s. And you can see that this is of concern to the radical right because Kennedy of Louisiana, Senator John Kennedy from Louisiana, had a really nasty comment the other day about how when the vice president's IQ reached 70, she should, I don't know, sell. She should sell. And that was a really astonishing political reveal, if you will. Kamala Harris is brilliant. I've not heard anybody doubt how smart she is. And if you listen to her, I used to listen to her when she was a senator, when I was cooking, just because when she was in hearings, not that I was interested in the hearings necessarily, but because it was really fascinating to hear her shape space with words. And I remember listening to her at a hearing and asking the person a whole bunch of questions about what was on the table, but she was very clearly building another argument from his responses to take forward in a different context. And, you know, she's obviously an incredibly smart woman, and she's done a lot as vice president. I've talked about this before. You asked again. She's had a lot to do in Latin America with trying to stabilize those countries so they send so migrants leave there less frequently. She had a really triumphal visit to Africa, and she's had a couple to Indonesia. She's been instrumental in the Indo-Pacific region because, of course, her family hails from there. Part of her family hails from there, which has given the United States a real leg up in its negotiations there that somebody who's a white man couldn't have done. She has a very, very popular following among young Americans, which a lot of people don't recognize. But if you look at photos of her and images of her from this tour she just did of college campuses, they're screaming for her like she's Beyonce, you know, and that is obviously concerning enough to the radical right that now they're trying to turn on her and say she's stupid. And Kennedy himself complained earlier that she was too smart for the position because she would use her intelligence to do things he didn't like. Now he's flipped and he's trying to say she's stupid. So the backstop to Biden's age is Kamala Harris. And you can tell by the attacks on her now from the radical right that they're very concerned about that. So that's one of the pieces that is interesting about what's going on now with whether or not there's going to be a primary challenge to Biden. Now, the other piece of that, of course, is what might happen if something happens in the next year with regard to Biden's health. And by the way, this is not a reflection of his age. This could be anybody. You know, none of us have any guarantees. And if that were the case, God forbid, because, I would say that about any front runner, and I will say the same thing about former President Trump. A sudden health change during an election season is never good. It is never good because there's too many conspiracy theories and too much stuff going on, and you just don't want that kind of instability. But if that were the case, the Democrats have a very deep bench, and where it would go is unclear. My guess is probably that Harris would move up into the top spot, but and that I know a lot of people say, oh my God, that shouldn't happen. Don't forget that she has a very strong following amongst people of color and against young people who are the backbone of the Democratic Party. So she would probably move into the top spot, or might, and then there are a number of other fabulous candidates that are pretty clearly keeping their powder dry but willing to step in. And the obvious ones are people like Gavin Newsom and Gretchen Whitmer, Gavin Newsom, governor of California, and Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, who the downside to both of them, unlike Harris, is they don't have experience in international affairs, and that's obviously crucial for the next term. And that's, I'm just talking off the top of my head here, so I didn't mean to slight your favorite person who's waiting in the wings. Really, really deep bench, like I say, lots of places that the Democrats are going to go in the future if we make it through the 2024 election. All right, so speaking of that, another quick question that people asked about. Oh, quickly, the question about why the Colorado judge both found that Trump had committed insurrection and yet said that he wasn't an officer of the government and therefore could be on the ballot. I'm seeing a lot of speculation about why that judge made that decision, and the first assumption is that she wanted to kick it up to the next level, and very quickly, and that what she found was not, because of, she established, her finding was that he had committed insurrection, that the next level won't take that up. That's going to stand. They will take up whether or not he can be on the ballot. So there was a legal reason to do that. The legal commenters say, I am not a lawyer, I read the legal commenters. And secondly, she didn't want to be the person who said that because of fears for her safety. And that is probably true, but it is heartbreaking that we're at that place with this particular candidate for president. All right, so speaking of which, was there another easy one? Oh, student loans. Somebody said, why aren't we doing anything about student loans? And this is a case where I certainly have dropped the ball. But Biden and Harris, of course, tried to address the weight of student loans early in their administration, and the Supreme Court overruled it. So what they have done actually seems to me to be quite smart, and that is that they've actually simply applied the laws as they existed. And if you have had extraordinary student loans, you know that the laws basically, it was almost impossible to make the laws work the way they were supposed to work if it would come out in your favor. And they have, just applying the actual laws that are already on the books, relieved billions of dollars in student debt. And you should look into that if that's an issue. And it's gotten almost no play. You can Google it and you can see that it has done. And people haven't written about it, including me, because I've sort of been holding off for a larger piece on the privatization of public schools and of student loans and how that all happened. But they have not ignored the issue. They've actually managed to create a lot of, to erase a lot of debt based on the laws that were already on the books. So, on the way the laws were originally written, people were not getting the kind of relief that they had been promised, and they've been addressing that. All right, so anything else that was easy? Trump on the ballot, student loans, destroying the economy, January 6th. All right, so let me put a bunch of these now together. That is, there you go. Erin had hers relieved. And this is not the time for a longer discussion about student loans, but the real issue, of course, with a number of them is that interest didn't stop. And interest accumulated so that people I know have paid back way more than they borrowed, and they're still deeply in the hole, and that's not a good thing. All right. So let me talk about what you're all asking about, I think, and that's the 2024 election. So let's step back a little bit as well here and think about what the 2024 election is really about, because there are many signs in every direction that this is a crucially important election. And once again, if you'll take my larger framework of power, there are certain people who want power over the rest of us. And they want to do it however it takes to get power. So the larger question is, if you're somebody who wants power in a democracy, what you want to do is you want to get people to vote for you based on what you promise them they're going to do. You want policies that people want to vote for. Well, the problem for the current day Republican Party, the MAGA Republicans, is that the vast majority of Americans don't want their policies. In fact, the vast majority of us want common gun safety regulations. We want access to abortion. We want compromise amongst the parties. We want, good schools and good roads. We want the basic things that probably virtually everybody on this webcast wants. So their problem is that if they were really acting as a Democratic, small d Democratic Party, they would change their policies. And I'm going to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole here, just because I just did an interview that was a lot of rabbit holes and it was really interesting. So one of the first things that Biden did when he got into office was he got rid of some of the stuff Trump had done, like trying to pack the government with loyalists, which Biden could have done. Trump had set up the system so that he thought he was going to be able to do it in his second term. Biden got rid of it. He could have used it himself, and he didn't. He got rid of it. But the other thing he did is he started to put in place things through executive orders, which Trump had done in a big way, and the Republicans have been doing for a while. But I was fascinated by Biden using it, because what Biden used executive orders for was to put in place things that were popular, whereas Trump had used them to put in place things that were unpopular, that couldn't make it through Congress. And that's the way Republicans had been using it. Biden used executive orders to put in place things that couldn't make it through Congress and were popular. And I thought that was really interesting, because it was not clear to me whether people would go, oh my God, he's using executive orders, or whether they would quietly say, well, this is cool, I like this, and that's actually what they ended up doing. Most people don't even know that happened. So while a few people on the radical right started screaming about it, most people are like, hey, we like these policies. It's still not a good way for a democracy to operate, having the leader be able to put in place things through executive orders. And just again, a reminder, an executive order is essentially like your boss telling you how to interpret something you're supposed to do. So if the company gets an order to speed up production, but it's not clear who's going to do what, the executive order is the equivalent of your boss coming to you and saying, hey, your job is to, grease the wheels a little faster or whatever. So anyway, so I just went down that rabbit hole because I thought that was really interesting, because Biden and the Democrats have had the great advantage in Biden's term of trying to put in place things that are popular, which is an interesting position to be in, that they're fighting desperately not to put in place things that are unpopular, the way the Republicans are, but to put in place things that are popular. So when over 80% of Americans want common sense gun safety legislation, and it's the Democrats who are fighting for it, it's a really different kettle of fish than if you're in a minority of 40% or 30% trying to put something in place the way that the Republicans currently are. So if they were truly a small d Democratic Party, the Republicans would change their policies. If the majority of people want something and you want to get voted for, you change your policies. Well, that's not what they've done, because they doubled down first on the concepts of the Reagan administration, the idea that what really matters is cutting taxes and cutting regulation, which are both unpopular. They doubled down on that. And by 1986, they recognized that they needed to control who could vote, and they needed to gradually control districts. That's how we get gerrymandering taking over so many state houses now. And they needed to use the filibuster, and they needed to focus on the Electoral College, and they needed to use all sorts of ways for a minority, a political minority, to stay in power. So they have themselves a real problem now going into 2024, because the policies of the current day Republican Party are anti-democratic. They have openly said they no longer believe in democracy, because they don't want the majority of us to have a say, because they don't agree with what we want. So somebody asked, why do the theocrats want to destroy democracy? Well, because they want to create a world in which LGBTQ plus people don't have equal rights, in which women don't have the right to abortion, in which states and people in those states are free to make their own laws about civil rights. They have very clear ideas based on their Bible of the way a society should work. Now, if you're not a member of that community, you look at that and you think that's not what democracy is about. And it's certainly not what American democracy is about, which was deliberately divorced from religion in the documents that the founders wrote about how to establish a democracy. But their problem is that they don't want a majority to have a say because the majority doesn't want that. So that's the answer to why the theocrats want to destroy the economy. But once again, think about whenever you think about these things, I would urge you, although I do it for you, but you should think about this. Who makes out? When you have these policies, who's winning? So one of the things I'm always hammering on is the idea that with Reagan's tax cuts, but then especially with the George W. Bush tax cuts and the Trump tax cuts, which are what has given us a budget deficit that is extraordinary and that bothers people like me. Not everybody is worried about that budget deficit. I am. Please don't fight with me about that. I will continue to read on it, I promise. But if you got rid of those, we would not have that budget deficit. But if you think about what happened with those tax cuts and the deregulation that began in the Reagan years, or actually shortly before that in the Carter years, but that's a slightly different story. What's happened is that money has moved upward really dramatically. Beginning in 1981, there's a really dramatic shift in which between 1933 and 1981, what economists call the Great Compression, where the difference between income and wealth at the very top of our society and income and wealth at the very bottom compressed. So that a Ford CEO, for example, made about 8 times what a Ford worker made. Now, or at least before this new contract, the difference was over 300 times. I mean, we've had this extraordinary shift that economists now call the Great Divergence. So if I look at these policies and I listen to the narrative that says, we got to cut taxes because otherwise, that guy over there is going to get a program that helps you. Okay, fine. But at the end of the day, who just got away with billions of dollars? It's the billions of dollars I look for. And this is one of the things that is important to understand in this moment, that for all the fights that are going down here about who's going to get what and all that, people at the very top of our economy are making scads of money, billions of dollars of money. And that's, part and parcel of this whole era, the era since 1981. So while they started to make money, they needed voters. They needed somebody to turn out and vote for them, because most Americans weren't stupid and they could see the fact that the middle class was getting hollowed out and they were losing out on all kinds of programs that they used to have, et cetera. And so what the Republicans did is they teamed up with evangelical Christians, and they promised to return to a society in which the Christians got to dominate the states and got to get rid of the rules, for example, about abortion, or about women being able to take on equal roles in society, or racial categories, traditional racial hierarchies. They teamed up with those evangelicals. And what you have now is this marriage has become one in which the evangelicals and the real radicals have essentially taken over. And they are no longer talking about just tax cuts and end of business regulation. They're talking about using a strong federal government to impose their will, including on businesses. So one of the things you're seeing now, and people always say, why do evangelicals support Trump? They support Trump because he promises to make sure they stay in power, even though he himself is not a great example of what one would assume a religious body or religious people would get behind. They're behind him because they believe that he will permit them to usher in what they consider the Christian future. All right, so when we're looking at the election of 2024, I'm sorry, I just saw somebody, I'm actually writing about this tonight, that Robert Reich was talking today about the greedflation that has taken place. That actually comes from a really interesting document from a senator from Connecticut who, no, Pennsylvania, I'm sorry, Bob Casey from Pennsylvania, that I will link in my letter tonight, where he actually does the rundown of how much of the money that we have paid really since 2021 has gone to essentially greed, to price gouging. And it's like about $3,600 a year for an average family making the median in Pennsylvania. So it's a lot of money. And it's interesting. It's worth looking at. All right. So looking at this, you have a lot of questions about the election of 2024. And one of the things that I want to start with, and I think you really must start with it, is that the Republicans are, somebody, by the way, just pointed out that this is a particular kind of Christian. That is absolutely true. They are the MAGA Christians, I guess. I don't know what you would call them. And we are currently seeing the rise in politics of a much more traditional Christian, by the way. And that's really interesting, and I'll write about that soon. So one of the things you're going to be seeing in 2024 is the fact that this is a political minority. The current day Republican Party is a political minority. And in order to win in 2024, they're going to pull out all the stops. And I wanted to go through some of these in order. First of all, we are already flooded with disinformation. And we will continue to be flooded with disinformation going into 2024. It's already been identified coming in scads from Russia, because Russia, of course, has a really, again, think, who profits? Who profits? If Trump gets back into office, how do you think the war in Ukraine is going to go? So one of the things that I'm sort of watching when we're looking at the stories and the narratives that are coming out about the Middle East is the fact that they have turned into really virulent attacks on Biden, some of which are principled, I'm sure, but some of which, of course, if you're looking forward to 2024, anything that will weaken Biden ultimately helps Vladimir Putin. And other people as well, Iran, who works with Putin, and to some degree, President Xi Jinping of China, who has an alliance with Russia, although obviously he's quite clearly backing off from that alliance and trying to reestablish more general ties, including with the United States, as he made very clear at APEC in San Francisco last week. There's going to be a ton of disinformation. And one of the things to remember, again, is, first of all, it is designed to make you want to quit, to make you stop paying attention, to make you get apathetic and think that everybody is doing it. And I'm going to go back to my argument there about power. No, everybody is not doing it. So yeah, some people will do anything they can to stay in power. I'm looking at you, Roger Stone and Paul Manafort. But lots of people want power because they want to do good things. They want to help people. And, I spend a lot of time now with politicians, and, rarely do they follow everything that I would like them to do. But I got to tell you, there are a lot of people out there who are good people, who are trying to do the right thing. And that doesn't mean I necessarily agree with what they do, but it does mean that they are not in it just for the money. They're not in it just to order people around. They honestly want to use power to do good for people. And that's a real difference from people, I think, like I'm going to call out here Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, who pretty clearly at this point is just pushing his podcast. If you look at the way he talks, everything he does, including stuff he is doing in the Senate, seems designed to drive people to his podcast, which is a moneymaker. There's a lot of money to be made on if you're in power as well. But I think it's a huge mistake to think that everybody is on the take or is in politics just because they are jerks. I mean, a lot of people really do want to do what's right. And that's what I'm saying. Reinforce those narratives. People will keep on doing that. So there will be incredible amounts of disinformation designed to make people think that everybody's corrupt and they should just walk away. Once again, who benefits if you do that? Those who are trying to take power and who are in a minority, because if they can get the majority to walk away, that's all they need. So the huge amounts of disinformation will come. It's worth being aware that that's what they're doing, and also to recognize that whatever comes at you, you can check the sources. So one of the things you can do, for example, on photographs is You actually, if you left click on that, or double click on a mouse pad that's built into a laptop, you could actually see the history of that photograph. So somebody posted a photograph the other day, and I had just learned how to do this, and I usually ignore photographs because I didn't know how to check them. And I discovered that although it was supposed to be about Hamas at this moment, in fact, it was from 2016 or 19 or something. And all I said under it was, this photo appears to be from whatever year it was. And lots of people jumped on it and said, well, does it matter? And I thought, well, yes, it does matter, because you're trying to convince people that this is happening at this moment. And the number of trolls who jumped on it suggested to me that this was a deliberate attempt at disinformation, which of course is all over Twitter at this point, which is dying. The latest from Musk will kill it. All right. So disinformation is one thing to be watching about. One of the other things that I'm really concerned about and watching is the polls, but not because I'm worried about what the polls say. They're not real. And I've talked about that before. Why are we seeing so many polls that say that Biden is in trouble and that Trump is winning? In fact, there are polls that say just the opposite, lots of them. There are polls all over the map. So why are the ones that say Trump is winning getting so much play? I will remind you that in 2020, he did the same thing. He kept saying to his followers, I couldn't possibly lose. Look how wonderful the polls are. And of course, his own people were paying for those polls. But I am very concerned that he's trying to set up for people who vote for him in 2024 the idea that the election is going to be stolen from him. So I think it's really important to push back on those polls, not to give them credence, and to say, we see what you're doing here. So be careful about the polls. Because I think he's setting up the idea that they are a sign that he is in fact winning, when in fact he's really not. I mean, we've never had a case of somebody running as a presidential candidate who has been indicted for 91 crimes in 4 separate indictments, and who has already been found guilty or found liable for sexual assault that a judge said any ordinary American would interpret as rape. Could not be, the jury could not, because of the specific law from New York under which that case was brought, and somebody who has already been found guilty of fraud as well with his businesses. So there's a lot there he's got to overcome, but they can overcome it if people stop turning out to vote and if people become willing to fight for him. So people have also asked why there is no I'm sorry, let me go here to the next one. So why did Mike Johnson, the new Speaker of the House, release the January 6th tapes? What are we going to see in them that we had not seen before? The first thing that we're going to see in them that we had not seen before is information about how the attackers breached the Capitol. The reason that the Capitol Police and the people responsible for keeping Congress critters safe didn't want everything released was because they said it would give people in the future information about how to cause trouble in the future. So the fact that Johnson is releasing those tapes is really not a good thing. It's a sign that it's a sign, first of all, that he is answering to the extremists in his party, and I'll explain why in a minute. It may be a sign that he is perfectly willing to participate in a future attempt to take control of the government. And I'm sorry to say that. I'm always a big proponent of giving everybody the benefit of the doubt, but I'm afraid I feel that these Republicans have given up the right to have us not be suspicious. And I'm suspicious of everything at this point, much of which will be unfair. But I think that we are stupid not to be suspicious of everything at this point, because so many times we've heard, oh, they would never do that, and then they do it. So I'm going to be suspicious of everything and say that putting this information into the hands of those who could use it for the wrong ends seems to me to be something we should be suspicious of. All right, so the other reason that he has released or begun to release the tapes is because the radical right insists that there is in those tapes proof that there was not an insurrection on January 6th, and that nobody really meant any harm. Things got a little out of hand, but it really wasn't that bad. Now, that's ridiculous. We have a very thorough bipartisan report from the House Select Committee to investigate the attack on the United States Capitol. I'm sorry, the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol. It had its notes, it had its testimony, it had everything publicly available. You can go check that. It's available on the internet. There is nothing there, but what they are doing is they're taking the playbook that the Republicans have used since 1994 to say it's there, trust us. And the idea that people will just assume that they're right. So one of the things that jumped out at me today, I was on one of the social media sites and someone said, oh, you Democrats, you lie about all this stuff, because the Republicans are, of course, considering an impeachment bill for President Biden. And someone said, well, you Democrats, you're always inventing things like the Russia investigation that turned up nothing. In fact, the Russia investigation turned up that the Trump administration, the Trump campaign worked with Russian operatives. It's in all the reports. They are publicly available. You can Google them. You can read it yourself. And as I've urged you to do before, and mind you, one of these was dominated by Republicans. The Senate Intelligence Committee was dominated by Republicans in those years. And you can Google it, and there's 7 volumes, but you don't have to read all those volumes. At the beginning of congressional testimony, of congressional reports, they put a really short, very readable introduction that summarizes everything. So whenever someone says, oh, there's a congressional report, and you think, I'm not going to read 2,000 pages, you never have to do that. You can read it yourself. It's very easy to read, and they're short. I want to say that the volumes, it's been a while since I've read them. I've read them all twice, but I want to say it's like 6 pages that outlines this. It's really very readable. But Trump supporters have accepted the lie that there's nothing there. And now they're just repeating it, and they're creating this fake story that makes people unwilling to say, no, it's right there, because it really is. And they're like, oh, you've got a tinfoil hat on. It's like, well, me and the former director of the FBI and the Senate Intelligence Committee and the House Intelligence Committee, and it's what they're trying to do is seed this idea that, oh, the tapes proved something else, because now they've been released. Now we know. And you saw this yesterday when Senator Mike Lee of, I want to say Utah off the top of my head, who was instrumental in pushing Trump's attempt to overturn the lawful results of the 2020 presidential election. Remember, it's Lee that Giuliani and Trump both call on that day. And at one point, they call Lee by accident. He hands the phone to Tommy Tuberville. Sorry, it should have another B. That Mike Lee yesterday started, as soon as the tapes came out, it wasn't yesterday, as soon as the tapes began to be released, started to push a conspiracy theory that one of the guys, Kevin Lyons, who has been sentenced to 51 months in prison for his participation in the attack on the Capitol, that he was actually a law enforcement officer. And he's like, is that a badge he's holding? And no, it was a vape he was holding. But Lee is already on board with the disinformation that is backed up by the release of these tapes. So one of the things this tells us is that the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson from Louisiana, is deep in bed with the MAGA Republicans. And we know that as well by the fact that he recently, as in yesterday, I think it was, went down to Mar-a-Lago where he met with Donald Trump. And he of course, has endorsed Donald Trump in the upcoming election. And that is a real problem, that the Speaker of the House is part of this minority group, this political minority that wants to take over American democracy and impose, in his case, theology on the rest of us. He is a Christian dominionist. He believes God has put him there to impose Christianity on American democracy. So one of the things that people have asked is why aren't there some laws about being able to lie in politics? Politicians shouldn't be able to lie. Well, here's the problem with that, is that you kind of want your lawmakers to be able to say whatever they think. Because if the government can start to say you're lying and you're not, it's a pretty slippery slope to get to. You can only say what the president says you can say. So anytime you think about the way that you want our government to work, it's always worth thinking about, what if the shoe were on the other foot? Like you might want Biden to be able to say, or Biden's Justice Department to be able to say to Mike Lee, you can't lie. At least you can't lie in Congress. But do you want Trump's Department of Justice to be able to say that to Adam Schiff? No, you don't. So the idea is that constituents will keep the liars in check, and that people will turn against habitual liars. And so far they haven't, which is really sort of astonishing. But that's why we don't have rules about politicians having to be honest. And the expectation was that constituents and their own Congress, their own colleagues, would hold them in check. Now, that being said, one of the things that I'm always pointing out whenever we talk about any of this stuff is to keep note, especially in congressional hearings, of who's been sworn in and who hasn't, because it is a crime to lie under oath. So, for example, I've pointed this out before. Rudy Giuliani, who worked with Trump trying to overturn the results of the election, kept holding hearings about how the election had been fraudulent, and he made it look like they were a courtroom. They were not. They were just a set, the same way that the opinion hosts on the Fox News channel look like they're in a newsroom. They have the news desks, they have all that stuff. Listen, I could set up this room to look like a newsroom. That would not mean it's a newsroom. It would mean that I bought the right furniture. And that's exactly what they're doing. They're trying to create a narrative that makes people think people are telling the truth, because we are accustomed to seeing people testifying before Congress or testifying in a courtroom under oath where they tell the truth. But you can always see the difference. You see people like Jenna Ellis, the lawyer for Trump in his attempt to overturn the election, literally going on social media and insisting that he'd been cheated and this had been a fraudulent election, and calling people out and just being horrible to people over it. When she was sworn in under oath, in tears, she said she had lied about all that. So always pay attention to who has been sworn in and who has not been sworn in. And this is really apparent in congressional hearings, because the Republican Congress people, and I expect the Democrats will start to do it going into 2024, are trying to set themselves up to get good sound bites to use in their social media or on the Fox News channel or Newsmax or any one of those those media channels. So they're just throwing crap at the poor witnesses while the witnesses are sworn in, and it's a crime for them to lie. So they're trying desperately to tell the truth. At the same time, they're just being covered in floods of lies, really quite dramatically. Last week, Marjorie Taylor Greene, a Republican of Georgia, pulled FBI Director Christopher Wray, just through the ringer for something that the Department of Homeland Security had done. And he finally said to her, "I'm not in the Department of Homeland Security." And it didn't really matter to her. She just bopped onto something else because she wanted the soundbite, and she wanted to be seen beating up on Christopher Wray, who's a sort of boogeyman for the alt-right. So she didn't care. And the poor guy, it just always makes me sad that our officials who actually have jobs are supposed to be, they have a job to do to inform Congress. That is their job. They're supposed to answer questions. They're supposed to tell the Congress what's going on, and they're supposed to course correct if things look bad. That's not what's going on now. So always pay attention to who's under oath and who's not, and who says things that can be backed up and who doesn't. And that's crucially important going into 2024. All right, so I think that's about all that I have. I just want to finish up today with the idea again of understanding power and understanding the way power works. So one of the things that is really important as you go forward, especially in the United States looking forward to 2024, but in any country and including in the issues in the Middle East, death and destruction is always terrible, without exception, right? But wanting peace is not enough, because you've got those people in power. Like most of us want peace, literally. Most of us are perfectly happy to say, you know, we'll figure this out. But there are some people who don't want peace. They want power. And if that means killing a lot of people, they're happy to do that. Think Vladimir Putin, for example, or think about Sudan, which is just heartbreaking right now, what's going on in Sudan, the death and destruction there, between two people who are just trying to get power over the country, and they're killing hideous amounts of people. And look what's happening in Pakistan, where 1.7 million people have been thrust back over the Afghan border, some of whom who have been in Pakistan since the Russian invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. So there are people who just want power. Most of us just want to get along, but there are people who just want power. So wanting there to be peace is great, but that's not going to make the people who want power do what we want them to do. The question is always finding the leverage that will force those people to back down. And that's not easy to do. So you can see in Russia, for example, where the different coalitions against Putin have tried to use sanctions. They've tried to back the Ukrainian military. They're trying to do all these different things to put enough pressure on Putin that his own people will turn against him, or that his advisors will turn against him, or that he will find some way to get out. They're always looking for some kind of leverage. And you can see this in spades in the Middle East, where the Biden administration and the Arab countries as well, this is not just about Biden, are madly trying to find leverage to get Hamas and Netanyahu to cut it out. But telling them to do so is completely useless. You have to find the leverage to do that. So always look for where the leverage is and the moves that people are making to get that kind of leverage, because that's how you can see how this is going to play out. So one of the things that is important when you're thinking about any of these things is whether your actions are contributing to that leverage or hurting that leverage. And I'm not suggesting that I have the answer to that, but it's always worth thinking about, is what I'm doing going to create more pressure that's going to make people do the things I want, or is it not going to do that? So deciding not to vote does not create pressure. Deciding to vote in certain ways does create pressure. Speaking up creates some pressure. You know, there's different ways to create pressure, and to think about where those pressure points are and how you can influence those pressure points. Because again, the vast majority of us are decent people who just want to get along. But we've got to deal with the fact that there are a group of people, a small group of people, who want power. And they're using every possible leverage they can to get that power. They're putting pressure in all kinds of places. And simply saying, but you're being mean, is not going to do it. We got to think strategically about where to put our pressure to make those things, make those people in power either decide that they have to change the way they're behaving, or to get other people in power, to get rid of them. So going forward into 2024 and into this Thanksgiving season, my favorite holiday, by the way, let's think about, first of all, how wonderful this community is, and how incredibly fortunate I feel anyway to be part of it, and how many of us out there are decent human beings who would like everybody to be able to give thanks for the country that they live in, and to give thanks for the rights and the privileges that they have, and to think of how many people don't have that, and maybe be a little bit conscious of how we can work to bring that a little bit closer, with charity and with grace, I think, perhaps a little bit in honor of Mrs. Carter. All right, I think that's enough, and I will sign out, and I will. You'll hear from me. I think I have something. I hope I have something special for tomorrow. We'll see. And then, of course, for Thanksgiving, it's all Lincoln all the time, right? Thank you for being here, and I will see you again soon.